To get a sense of how the India story has changed at Davos over the past 2.5 decades, we're joined now by N K Singh, who's been coming to Davos since 1997 and has really seen the India story in Davos and globally change over the last 2.5 decades. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us at the India Today studios at the World Economic Forum. Most recently, N K Singh was the co-convener of the G20 expert panel on the reform of multilateral development banks, and we'll talk to him about what action the report that he presented has seen since. But I want to start by getting you, Mr. Singh, to walk our viewers through how you've seen the India story change here at Davos over the past 2.5 decades.
Well, Rahul, thanks for having me here. It's great to be in the studio with the spectacular view of what people associate Davos with. The storm, the uncertainties, the frequent change in weather and temperatures. Yes, Davos has changed almost unbelievably from the time when I started coming, which you say. Three ways of change. First, I think Davos has become much bigger, many more hotels, many more people, many different stakeholders, many more class of people, many more organizations and many more countries. So the sheer size and the complexity of Davos has changed. Second, when I first came in 1997, India was a somewhat unknown story. We were trying to talk about India. We were trying to promote about India. And there were questions on the stability of the Indian economic, and more than economic, stability of the political matrix of India. Decisively, third, from a viewpoint of India seeking investment, what I perceive now, investors are seeking India. We do not have to come to Davos to sell India. India is really the favorite in multiple ways of investors here. Every investor I have met since the time yesterday, whether it be John Turtle or the New York Stock Exchange or many other corporates, want to deepen, widen and diversify the presence in India. They regard that only one presence is not good enough. But the India growth story, which has just begun, is only going to deepen as India's own global position and matrix becomes deeper and more widespread. So in that sense, Rahul, it's a tectonic change in multiple ways from the time when I first began my Davos experience.
Interesting. One of the big differences, Mr. Singh, between the time when China started the fastest growth that any country has registered in the modern world in centuries, that was a time also where global trade was the flavor of the time. Now we're seeing so many headwinds against global trade. And this is the moment where India is trying to emerge and occupy its space in the sun. Does that then, comparative to China, in your view, put India in a disadvantageous position from a time and space perspective?
No, not really. Because very frankly, there's an advantage which India has, which is decisive over China. First, let's not forget that people who compare India and China forget the fact that important economic reforms began in India in 1991. China had begun in 1973, 1974. We remained trapped in the mindset of an excessively regulated economy till it became impossible to put really the cloak on our crisis in 1991. So let's not forget that. But I think that sharply address your question, there are three important decisive advantages which we now have over China. First and foremost, the most decisive change has been that we have choices and options far more and far deeper in China. The bulk of the investment in India's infrastructure are currently being made. We therefore have an option of the choice of technology, of selecting options which are based on renewable, non-fossil fuel energy, and to harness equally what the technology options have provided in terms of a much higher accelerator in growth. That advantage China did not have, which in terms of the fortuitous circumstances it has come to India's way. Second, and I think the third, the false dichotomy between manufacturing and trading is far more, and it's only embedded in the minds of some economists. It requires all the three segments. It requires certainly manufacturing in terms of job creation, long-term sustainability. You require, of course, also the growth of the primary and tertiary sector, and the services sector are part of it. So I think that we seek the synergy between the growth multipliers from trade and the growth multipliers from manufacturing. We require the multipliers from the services sector, from the primary and secondary, and the tertiary sector growing in tandem. These are advantages which India will choose decisively.
Recently, you co-chaired the G20 expert panel on the reform of multilateral development banks. Your report was presented in October, and one of the concerns with some of these exalted ventures often is that they're great in prose, they're good ideas. Do you actually see some of that being implemented in the way that banks like the World Bank and the other MDBs actually function, as to say?
Yes, I'm very happy to be able to share with you, Rahul, that we were fortunate that the reform of the multilateral development banks was a powerful idea which had been articulated by Prime Minister Modi before even India had assumed the presidency of the G20. So it was only natural that when India assumed the presidency, a multilateral development bank reforms expert group, of which I was privileged, as you said, along with Larry Summers, to be the co-convener, gave two reports. They gave the report, first report, what we call a triple agenda, which we gave into Ahmedabad, and the final report, which we called better, bolder, and bigger. What did the core recommendation of this? The core recommendation was that if assuming that the multilateral development banks in an average year were able to lend $120 billion, what the world needs is $500 plus billion a year. It requires, if you add climate change, it requires a huge mobilization of domestic capital resources. We have given a report with 30 very tangible recommendations. 30 tangible recommendations to triple the capacity of the multilateral development banks from $110 billion a year to at least over $300 billion a year. We have given recommendations which will enable the harnessing of private capital of $500 billion. We have given recommendations that with the optimization of the balance sheet, they can do much more. You ask the question, will it gather dust or will it be implemented? I'm happy to be able to share with you that as recently as in COP28, when I was in a panel with the MDBs, along with Mr. Ajay Banga, he informed everyone present there that he has set up separate working groups on each of these 30 recommendations. Action, Rahul, has begun more decisively than we would have contemplated. Of course, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to be able to have and garner the political will in terms of the recapitalization of these MDBs, which would inevitably be needed if they want to be bigger, along with how to harness and optimize the existing balance sheet. If, for instance, to give an example, in the $22 billion of capitalization that the World Bank Group has, it has lent so far $900 billion, at 7 times the recapitalization. In comparison to that, what it has done in terms of harnessing private capital has been rather modest. So I think that when they begin to
how do you see that change?
So that is being changed in multiple ways. Action has begun. Progress may be tardy. How do you mitigate the risk of private capital? What are the kinds of perceived risks that private capital sees? Private capital is available. How does it harness the private capital in blending it with multilateral finance? We have addressed that issue. There are several risks. One, of course, foreign exchange fluctuations and uncertainties. We have made some tangible proposals on that. In terms of the credibility of regulatory regimes is a very important suggestions which we have made. In terms of the changes in the processes and procedures of the multilateral development banks, let me share with you, Rahul, that the multilateral development banks had fallen a prey to the same kind of vices which exists in all public sector organizations. Wait for clients to come up, do a kind of due diligence, took really 27 months from the concession of a project to actual disbursement. Can you cut it down to 10 months or 12 months? Action on that requires changes of processes, it changes of procedures. Private capital, you need to seek them out. Don't wait in an approach where they approach you. Go and seek them out. You require changes in terms of targets, in terms of the work culture, and as I said, processes and procedures which will bring about. All these are embedded in the integrated set of proposals which we have put forward.
Given that China,
and I'm happy
yes,
that action has commenced.
given that China, Mr. Singh, is trying to build its own development finance institutions, how does the report that you've submitted on reforming largely the Western architecture of multilateral development banks fit into India's agenda when it comes to trying to emerge as a leader of the global south?
Don't forget, Rahul, that the needs of capital are so high that you need capital from multiplicity of agencies. India is an important member of the new development bank, set up in China. India is an important member, the number 2 person of the infrastructure development bank. Chinese also. They're an important part of it. We have contributed. We are also a recipient of that. So we really regard that availability of multilateral finance is certainly far better than merely mercantilist financing opportunities. And so India, as one of the original believers in the broad principle that the world is better off in having multilateral institutions than having bilateral mercantilist driven modes of financing, will support these institutions. I see no conflict in that. Where the real problem will arise is if will the old Western model, and in what manner the institutions created earlier, change in the changing geopolitics and power configuration in the decades forward. That's an issue which will be a daunting challenge, how to balance the geopolitics with the balance of the changing global political power. There, adjustments will have to be made, negotiations will have to be taken in a manner. But in the meantime, till that takes place, we concluded that it would be foolish to wait for that to happen before these MDBs are strengthened and their capability inherently augmented substantially to give us the advantage of better, bolder, and bigger MDB system.
This is the year of elections globally. More elections this year than any year till 2048. India goes to polls as well. In terms of economic reform from here, how do you think the Modi government should be pressing the accelerator? And you've seen so many governments. You were secretary to Atal Bihari Vajpayee. You worked through so many regimes cutting across the political spectrum. How do you compare this government's efficacy on economic management with those of governments you've seen in the past?
That's a very difficult, broad, sweeping question, because in our post-independence India has seen multiple governments. Each government had their own set of challenges. I mean, there were governments for a long time which had embedded in the Fabian socialist mindset, who did not want to really think of private capital. There were governments of that kind too. There were governments which believed greatly in the power of a planning commission, in which everything to be regulated. That socialist mindset and Fabian mindset did not serve India for very long. It may have temporarily done, but we've failed to adjust, and resulting with years of fiscal profligacy in one form or the other, taking recourse to multilateral lending procedures, going to the International Monetary Fund, and so on, which resulted in the great balance of payments crisis of 1991. 1991, given no choice, and I would say that it's a debatable question whether there were a conscious decision or there were decisions of the circumstances which compelled those decisions to be taken in 1991. Significant reforms had begun. After that, the different governments which faced the challenges, the period of Dr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, which I had privileged to be, took some very important decisive steps in multiple directions in terms of the opening up of the telecom sector, in terms of the road sector, in terms of being able to act with panache. The nuclear deal positioned India on the high table. Decisive changes were taking place. Then, of course, we had a period of 10 years where it has often been said that if Dr. Manmohan Singh, as the Prime Minister, would have done what he did as the Finance Minister, India would have been better off. That has followed now. But this great period of decisive economic reforms, and the pace of change has changed from incrementalism to transformational changes. In terms of using every opportunity, even the pandemic saw deeper reforms than many countries have done in peace times. That reform momentum is an ongoing momentum. Couple of things. Look at the fact that during that period, important decisions in relation to opening up of the public sector to private capital was taken at that time.
Correct.
That was, if you ask me, one of those, so to say, which was beyond the imagination that you will want to do away with public sector entities. But it was done. Look at the outcome. Decisively, the world regards India as one of the brightest spots, symmetry of monetary and fiscal policy, continuation of deep structural reforms, a growth process of which the base number is around 7.5, and one expects that with this momentum, we'd like to really move towards a double-digit direction because we are committed as a nation, in Prime Minister's call to make India a developed country by 2047.
Lastly, and before I conclude, when you look at the India story, given your long journey in where it stands now, what is it that gives you the greatest optimism and what is it that causes greatest anxiety?
Well, what gives me the greatest optimism is a continued, decisive, innovative political leadership. That's very optimistic. And what is optimistic is the innate innovative ability of India as a nation in terms of its young demography, believing in the power and harnessing technology to its advantage in a world which has become increasingly wired, which has become increasingly technology dependent, at the cutting edge of technology. I think that fills me that given the expectations of our young population, will not achieve the kind of replacement rates, given the advantages that we are not only the most populous country now in the world, but a country, the young population, wired to innovation, technology, filled with optimism and expectation. What worries me most was that question. What worries me most are exogenous circumstances with the geopolitics and the environment in the world bring down global growth rates in a decisive way, which is stymie the multiple advantages in our ability to be able to harness the rest of the world which can support the decisive changes currently taking place in India.
You've brought the wealth of your insights accumulated over decades to bear during the course of this conversation and shared some very valuable thoughts. Thank you very much, Mr. N K Singh, for joining us at the India Today Business Studios here at the World Economic Forum in Davos. I hope you have a great week. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.